Okay, so this is the last one in our batch of side-by-side comparisons with the R5c and a bunch of other cameras. These are our side-by-sides with a regular, normal exposure. So we can use this to look at how each camera naturally looks with just a simple contrast and saturation boost in post, but mainly here we're looking at sharpness and detail. And this is often a contentious subject, as a sharper and a more detailed image is sometimes not the main thing that people are looking for. In fact, some people even see it as a bad thing in some situations. But remember, at the end of the day, you can always soften up a look of a camera, either in post or with diffusion, like a Pro Mist filter, for example. As long as a camera looks rich and naturally detailed rather than overly digitally sharp, I think most people would agree it is a definite advantage. And if there's one thing the R5c can do, it is produce sharp and detailed images. This is the highest resolution camera in Canon Cinema EOS lineup, and it shows. So let's dive right into comparing it to the regular R5. In 8K RAW, both cameras look exceptionally detailed. With the right post-production workflow, this 8K RAW is really impressive. And remember, you can now record in the R5c with no recording limits, while the R5 had to make these major logistical compromises in order to use the mode for anything more than a few short clips. With the R5c, you can do an entire production in this 8K RAW with no problem whatsoever. Even push it up to 8K 60p as well if you want to. For detail, I can barely see any difference between the two cameras, but there is a big difference in color, which did surprise me. Now, we saw a bit of a difference in color in our IBIS comparison video. All of the RAW settings are the same, and because it's RAW, I can override the custom white balance we did in case that was what was throwing it off, because I did think that might be what was happening when we did that IBIS video. But no matter what we change in these tests, the RAW settings, the R5 looks much more magenta than the R5c does. Over in the oversampled 4K modes, it's a similar situation. Detail looks very similar between the two cameras, but the colors are quite different, which I do find quite surprising considering this is the same sensor and the same settings. Perhaps Canon have tuned the R5c maybe in order to make it a bit of a closer match with the rest of their Cinema EOS cameras. Let's now compare it to the Sony A7s Mark III and the Canon C70 in each camera's regular 4K recording modes. So this is 4K XFAVC on the R5c, 4K XAVC SI on the A7s, and 4K XFAVC on the C70. The R5c is the only one here that's oversampled, and it is very obvious when you're looking at the footage. It has by far the most detailed image from each of these cameras. The C70 is definitely the softest, which is not a huge surprise. Sharpness has never been the camera's strength, although apparently the new RAW recording modes in the new firmware update are going to be considerably more detailed, which is something which I'm really looking forward to testing once we do that firmware update. But for now, the C70 is the softest here. The A7s is pretty detailed considering there's no oversampling going on here, it's just a normal 4K sensor. I'm always really surprised by just how much detail Sony have managed to squeeze out of the A7s Mark III's 4K sensor. But the R5c is a clear winner by a long way. This is where we see that 8K oversampling really working its magic. And even when you show this on a 1080p timeline, you can just really tell that the R5c has a much more detailed, naturally detailed image than either of these other cameras. I also wanted to look at 1080p, as in the R5, it really dropped down in quality in its 1080p mode, which was a shame, as a lot of our customers still have to dip in and out of 1080p for some jobs, where they don't need the quality and the extra data of 4K. So I was a bit worried at launch that the R5c might do the same thing and be very soft in 1080p. But it doesn't look like that is the case here at all. The R5c is so much more detailed than the R5 is. We're still getting some oversampling, and I'm not 100% sure, but I think looking at this, it might even be oversampling from the full 8K sensor still, all the way down to 1080p. But this means it looks far more detailed than both the R5 and the A7s. I mean, the A7s doesn't look anywhere near as detailed, but it does do pretty well. It's certainly much better than the R5. The other area I really wanted to look at here was the 4K high frame rates modes, because this doesn't use any oversampling anymore on the R5c. So the big question is, does the R5c look any better at 4K high frame rates, like 100 or 120 frames a second, than the R5 does? And side by side, I just can't see much of a difference here, unfortunately. They look very similar in terms of sharpness. I suppose the R5c does look like it has a slightly lower noise floor though, which is a good thing. Now unfortunately we didn't get a clip from the A7s Mark III in its 4K 120p mode. I'm a bit annoyed at that now I'm looking back at those results. Apologies for that, that's my fault. We were rushed on the day and I missed it off the list. But we know from our previous tests that the A7s Mark III is definitely much sharper than the R5, so I'm pretty confident in saying that the A7s Mark III would definitely be the most detailed of the bunch here at 4K 120p. So this is one of the first areas where I've been a bit disappointed by the R5c. I would have loved to have seen an improvement here. The quality of the 4K 120p is fine. It's certainly nothing to worry about. It's definitely good enough for most work. But considering the huge improvements we've seen in other areas, like in 1080p, I would have loved to have seen a bit more of an improvement here at high frame rates as well. I guess it's because the camera doesn't have enough processing power to do both high frame rates, 4K and the oversampling at once, which is definitely understandable. Both are very processor intensive tasks, but it would have been nice to just be a little bit sharper to match maybe the A7s. To wrap up, let's now put it next to the 1DC to see just how far we've come. 10 years ago, remember, the 1DC was a state-of-the-art 4K camera which hit the market at £15,000. And just look at how much better the R5c looks. This, I think, really highlights just how good these cameras have got now. I mean, yes, the R5c has consistently outperformed the 1DC when it's been pushed, like in over and underexposure and at high ISOs. But this is just regular, ordinary footage. And the R5c looks vastly, vastly better. It's much more detailed. The 1DC just looks a bit plasticky again, especially in high detail areas like George's hair. I mean, if you put these two clips blind in front of pretty much anyone, I think nearly every single person would end up choosing the R5c. It's day and night better in pretty much every single way. I mean, we can debate the differences between each of these new cameras as much as we like, but when you sit back and you look at just how far the camera industry has come in the last few years, it's very impressive stuff. We have access to some pretty remarkable equipment nowadays. So that wraps up the technical side-by-side comparisons which we managed to record with the camera before its launch. We do have the camera coming back though fairly soon. We're going to have autofocus tests at the top of our list to do once we get the camera back, as I know a lot of people are itching to see that. But if there's anything else you want us to look at or test with the camera when it arrives back here, please do let us know in the comments section. If you want to buy any of these cameras for yourself, of course, head over to proav.co.uk. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.